Hello and welcome to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I am your host, Adam Conover. On this podcast, I talk to scholars, academics, journalists, some of the most fascinating people from around the world of ideas to tell you about the work that they do. I am also the host of a TV show called Adam Ruins Everything that airs on True TV. You can watch the show Tuesdays at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, or at truetv.com/Adam Ruins Everything and the Watch True TV app. Today's guest is Professor Courtney Jung. She appeared on Adam Ruins Having a Baby, our season premiere, where she discussed the myths behind breastfeeding. Now, if you guys have had a baby or know anyone who has a baby, you know that this is a very fraught issue. People have very, very strong feelings about it. Well, on the show today, Courtney is going to walk us through the history of that issue and some of the myths behind breastfeeding and formula feeding and why you don't really have to worry all that much. Courtney is a political science professor at the University of Toronto and the author of a book on this issue called Lactivism. We're so excited to have Courtney join us today from Toronto, so let's get to the interview. Well, Courtney, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So how did you get involved in, studying the topic of breastfeeding, formula feeding, lactivism, this whole issue?
Well, basically, I was inspired by breastfeeding myself and my own experiences. But what's interesting from the perspective of political science is how quickly we've moved from breastfeeding being something that's very unpopular, that's very infrequently done in society, not the norm, to being the norm. So basically, over the course of my lifetime, when I was born, people predominantly formula fed. I was formula fed. And then 40 years later, when I had my daughter, it didn't even cross my mind to feed her formula. It never occurred to me not to breastfeed. And so that's a really big shift in a very short period of time. And so that's very interesting. How do we come to a whole new consensus as a society?
And you were just interested in that as a political scientist.
I was interested in that as a political scientist. And then, of course, I was also interested in how it became such a moral issue. And then once I realized it was also a class issue and a race issue, then of course, I really, decided I needed to write a book about this. Before, I was thinking just maybe a pamphlet, something,
A brochure. Right, I mean, that's
something brief and angry.
Well, that's one of the reasons we did it on the show is it's one of those topics that, it seems so simple. It's just, hey, how do you feed your baby? But then when you talk to, I'm of the age where I have friends who are, who have recently had babies, and this is an issue for them. And they talk about how shocked they are about how high emotions run about it. It seems like it, on the face of it, it would be a simple issue, but it's one that has all of these big issues and concerns bound up in it in incredibly complex ways.
Right. I mean, that's one of the things that I write about in the book is how breastfeeding is so much more than a way to feed a baby, that it's become a marker of who we are as human beings. So for feminists, for example, breastfeeding has become a symbol of female empowerment, a symbol of something that women alone can do with their bodies. For women on the Christian right, it's a symbol of submission to God's will, and they can cite 27 different places in the Bible where God enjoins women to breastfeed or invites breastfeeding women into the temple or whatever, mentions breastfeeding in some way. It's also an environmental issue because formula cans are bad for the environment and because of travel, etc. It's even an issue with the local food movement because, after all, what could be more local than your breasts and breastfeeding? So for many different groups, it's basically become it's a symbol of so much more, of so many things that you believe in. It's, back to nature. It's against big business. So it's an issue for the left. It's sort of, the people who one of the groups of people that are very committed to breastfeeding are people who go to farmers markets, who practice yoga, who wear their babies in a sling, and they also breastfeed. So it's part of a whole
Lifestyle.
package. Yeah, lifestyle and a package of things that go together that sort of demonstrate who you are as a human being. And then, of course, it's also, one of the signature activities of attachment parenting. So it also indicates what kind of parent you are, not just what kind of person, but what kind of parent.
So you said that in the 40 years, we've gone from formula feeding being the norm to formula feeding not being the norm and breastfeeding being the norm. But then before that period, breastfeeding was also the norm before formula was invented. And so it looks like we're looking at a pretty quick rise and fall. Can you just sort of walk us through that big cultural shift, like the rise of formula and then the fall of formula and how it happened?
Sure. So formula was invented in the 1880s. Until then, women who couldn't breastfeed did feed their babies alternatives, milk, cow's milk, sugar, water, some combination like that. And babies who were fed that often died of malnutrition. So starting in the 1880s, you have a situation where there is an alternative to breastfeeding that will work. And you also have a lot of women entering the job market, women going to work in factories, etc. So there was a class distinction between women who were breastfeeding and women who were formula feeding that had to do with women entering the workplace. And so formula became very popular over the course of the early 1900s until about the 1970s because it was convenient. And also because it was considered to be the modern way to feed. So it was part of a larger move or trend toward medicalization. So at the same time that you have, medicalization of childbirth, breastfeeding takes a second place to formula feeding, and pediatricians become very involved in child feeding and every other aspect of child rearing.
Right, but it started as, I mean, in the sort of days before formula feeding, as you said, there were sort of not good options in the case of if you had a mother who was unable to breastfeed, or there was this sort of problem of how do you feed children, and so formula feeding did initially save lives, and then it sort of became this medically approved way to make sure that children got proper nutrition.
Absolutely. And formula improved as well, over time, invented in the 1880s, but over time they added vitamins, they added minerals, and formula got better and better. And it was medical, right? It was scientific. It was something that was created in a lab.
Right.
And so doctors believed, and mothers believed too, that it was better for their babies. But of course, you're right. It did initially save many, many lives. Doctors now estimate that about 15% of women don't produce enough milk to feed their babies. And, so that number is likely to have remained steady over time. Probably historically, about 15% of women didn't make enough milk to feed their babies, which means that those babies either were wet nursed, if they were lucky, if there was that option, or
Right.
they were fed an alternative that most likely didn't work, and they died of malnutrition.
And it makes sense, by the way, that you say that formula feeding represented the modern lab tested way to feed a baby, etc. And I think today in our day and age we're often sort of repelled by that sort of idea of something being very very modern or very scientific, and we want the more natural approach. But in the early part of the 20th century, I mean, that was those sort of innovations were the ones that saved lives, right? It sounds like it was bound up with I don't know, penicillin and vaccines and sterilization and all of these different technological advances that were demonstrably causing people to live longer and die less and reduce infant mortality and sort of taking us out of the dark ages in a sort of broad sense, if you will. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You have this transition. You're in a time period in the early 20th century, or let's say the first half of the 20th century, not just the early part of the century, where medical advances are really coming fast and furious, and they are very important, and they do play an important role in saving lives. Not least, medicalized childbirth. We think of that now as a terrible thing, but women died in childbirth very, very often. And the fact that they almost never die in childbirth is something that we now take for granted, but
Right.
that was not true 100 years ago.
Yeah, it often feels like when we try to correct the mistakes of the present, that those mistakes were made in order to avoid a worse past. Does that make sense? It's like, we're concerned now about the over medicalization of, these sort of natural processes, but that sort of initial urge to medicalize them came from the fact that people were dying sort of left and right in the olden days. And while we shouldn't overlook the problems with our current way of doing things, we should also acknowledge that we started doing them because they were stopping people from dying.
Right. So now what we have is we've just swung in the opposite direction, and in my opinion, and a lot of people believe that we've swung too far in the opposite direction. So the idea that formula is evil and dangerous is too far in the opposite direction. The idea that formula can kill babies is simply not true. We're very lucky to have formula. That doesn't mean formula is better, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's dangerous or that it is something that we should avoid.
So let's walk through how we got to the present, where that idea is so pervasive. So in the through to the 70s, you said formula sort of became the dominant way to feed babies. What changed? What occurred that caused us to end up in the opposite position? 40 odd years later.
Well, it started in the 1950s. In 1956, La Leche League was organized, and La Leche League was started by 7 Catholic women were who breastfed their babies and who believed in breastfeeding and wresting control back from doctors to mothers. So getting control back over childbirth and over child rearing and over child feeding. And so they started this organization as a support network for mothers who wanted to breastfeed. And that was 1956. And it grew quickly because there were mothers who wanted to breastfeed. And at the time, it was very hard to breastfeed because most doctors were recommending formula feeding, and the norm was formula feeding. So you have La Leche League starts in 1956.
Were those doctors was the medical industry, at all actually preventing women from breastfeeding, or was it a matter of sort of taboo and norms, and people are going to look at you funny and your doctor's going to say, well, I advise you not to do this, or were there really barriers in place at that point?
I don't think there were really barriers in place, except for the barriers of it being very hard to learn how to breastfeed in a situation where, women no longer have easy access to their mothers and sisters. They might not live close by. Doctors are recommending against breastfeeding, recommending formula feeding. And when babies are born in hospitals and they're fed formula immediately as soon as they're born, and then you get formula to take home with you, that sort of becomes your norm quickly, and you're unable to then start a breastfeeding relationship with your baby after that, in all
Right.
likelihood.
So that's a period when the pendulum is super in the formula direction. We've we've almost societally forgotten how to breastfeed in a way.
Exactly, exactly. And doctors know nothing, the doctors were all men, and they couldn't possibly tell you how to breastfeed. They had no idea. And that's part of the reason that they're against it, right? Because it's an area in which they have no expertise,
Right.
and so they can't be the experts on how you're feeding your baby and what you're feeding your baby.
They have no control over it. They have no. It's sort of entirely out of their purview, and they're sort
Yeah.
of trying to keep everything within their jurisdiction.
Yes. Yes,
Got it.
exactly.
Okay. All
I
right. Well,
mean, it's we're talking about a time in which doctors routinely recommended that mothers weigh their children before and after a feeding, record the weights, and then give that information to the doctor when they went for routine checkups.
wow.
So it's that level of scrutiny that mothers were under from the medical profession in that period, in the 50s, 60s.
Got it. Okay. So I understand the conditions under which La Leche League formed. So then what went on after that?
Right. So La Leche forms and it wants to take control back from the medical profession. That's in 1956. In the 1970s, you get the beginning of the feminist movement, the second wave feminist movement. And the feminist movement has a slightly different agenda, although in some ways surprisingly similar, right? Like wrest control back from the medical profession. And so in the early 1970s, you have the publication of Our Bodies, Ourselves, and feminism takes up breastfeeding as a feminist issue. So the Mothers of La Leche League were not feminists. They were not hippies in any way. It was a profoundly conservative movement. But in this one way, they did dovetail with the feminist movement. And then also in the 1970s, you have Nestle beginning to aggressively market formula in developing countries. And what happens in developing countries, Nestle is selling formula, powdered formula that needs to be mixed with water. And many women in poor countries don't have access to clean or sterilized drinking water. And so they're mixing formula with dirty water, and their babies are becoming sick. They're also over diluting the formula because it's very, very expensive. So they're basically feeding their babies just sort of, water that's milky white, but nothing much more than water.
Wow.
So you have a big spike in infant malnutrition and mortality in the 1970s, and doctors and public health advocates very quickly link that spike in infant mortality and malnutrition, link that to formula feeding in developing countries.
Let me ask, because Nestle is the company that virtually invented formula, correct?
Yes,
Like Henry, like the
Henri Nestlé.
Henri Nestle.
Oui,
Great.
pardon.
And so they sort of pioneered formula. They made their whole. This is the Coca-Cola of formula, basically.
Yes, yes.
Now, in so doing, initially, I'm sure they saved lives, right? But do you feel that this, action this was the 70s, this happened in these developing nations, correct?
Yes.
how big of an error was that on Nestle's part? I mean, were they really, pushing formula far more than they should have been? Was this sort of, again, was this another example of that formula pendulum being too far, where they were really pushing an unhealthy product in this case, or?
Absolutely. I mean, this was an unbelievably irresponsible campaign that they were undertaking in poor countries. They knew that they were selling a product that could not safely be used in the developing world.
Really?
I mean, for starters, women couldn't read the directions that were on the formula cans.
Huh.
Right? Many women, most of the women who were buying the product were illiterate. And it wasn't in the local language. It was in French or it was in English. So they were absolutely doing something that was morally reprehensible, definitely. And they knew that they knew what they were doing. Nestle hired women in developing countries and dressed them as nurses and sent them into hospitals where they would almost literally masquerade as nurses.
Really?
Yeah, you can see pictures. You can easily find pictures of the Nestle nurses in South Africa. And then they would go into hospitals posing as nurses, and they would go to the homes of new mothers dressed as nurses, even though they were just... They were not. They were not medically trained in any way. They were just Nestle salespeople. So there are all kinds of things like that. And Nestle, of course, did what it did in wealthy countries, is that it gave away formula in hospitals, knowing that if mothers got formula in hospitals for free, they would continue to use that formula once they got home.
It's the free sample mentality.
Exactly.
Well, that is completely reprehensible, and I also understand why. I mean, this is sort of the ultimate fear of the modern capitalist medical scientific machine, right? Where even though the product started out as something that would that really helped people and that saved lives, now it's sort of being pushed where it has no business being by this company saying, well, now we're going to enlighten the masses and bring them the light of our perfect product and lift them out of darkness, except that the product they're bringing has no place in that in that community and ends up causing a disaster. I mean, this is like textbook. When people want to start criticizing, capitalism, colonialism, all those different concepts, this is like a textbook case of that run amok.
Absolutely. And so starting in the 1970s, 1974, you have the Nestle boycott starts. And it's exactly because of the publicizing this situation in developing countries. And that's where you get the beginning of the idea that formula is actually evil and dangerous. Because it was evil and dangerous in poor countries where formula was being over diluted and mixed with, unclean water.
Right.
It was, in fact, killing babies. It may have killed even millions of babies. There are no statistics about that, but it definitely was killing babies.
And so I'm so glad that we're talking about this, because this was not a nuance of the story that we had time to get into on our show, where we're telling the story of formula in sort of 7 minutes, because it sounds like what happened was this very real malfeasance on the part of Nestle, which clearly deserved the boycott. People needed their consciousness raised about this issue. The word needed to be spread about it. It ended up giving formula this sort of like cast or taint of, the idea that formula itself was dangerous, which is not actually the case. Despite the fact that this company acted very poorly, the idea of formula generally acquired a negative impression that it perhaps didn't deserve. Is that correct?
Right. Well, so formula, if you mix formula properly with clean water, there's nothing dangerous about formula. And yes, so the pendulum swung, and it swung very hard against formula companies.
Got it. And so what? How did that take place over the ensuing decades?
Well, the first thing that happened was an NGO in England published a pamphlet called Nestle Kills Babies.
Huh.
And this pamphlet became very widely available. Lots and lots of people read it. The Nestle boycott started in the UK. It spread all over Europe, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, etc. There were hearings against the Nestle Corporation. I think it was Ted Kennedy conducted hearings in the 1970s against the Nestle Corporation, congressional hearings or Senate hearings that were very, very damning for Nestle. The president of Nestle was compelled to admit on television that what they were doing was wrong and dangerous, and that they knew that they were sending formula to countries where women did not have clean water and where it would clearly kill babies. So this was a really set formula back, and then in this period, formula becomes, or rather breastfeeding becomes a symbol of the fight against capitalism and big business. Mm-hmm. So precisely because of, greedy capital and big business doing these horrible things in developing countries, breastfeeding becomes an issue of the left, and it becomes a form of activism. And so that's a really interesting moment.
It totally makes sense why it would as well. I mean, if you look at the narrative, well, you've got this company that's pushing this product in this horrible way that killed, so many babies, and they want us to pay for this formula. You've got doctors pushing it, and now when you have a baby, the corporate America and the medical industry wants you to pay through the nose for the privilege of feeding your baby. When you've got the food right on you, you can make it yourself. And what's it's the ultimate take power back from the capitalist machine sort of vibe. I mean, I absolutely understand why that happened. It
Right.
makes total sense as a narrative.
Well, and that's the great story about, the rise of breastfeeding, or the comeback of breastfeeding, is that it all makes sense. Every step along the way is a good step
Right.
up until a certain point.
So describe that point to us. Where do you feel that where we crossed that threshold, and what happened?
Well, it's hard to say. In the late 1990s, so at this point we've got La Leche League, we've got feminism, and we've got the Nestle boycott. So there are three moments or three catalysts to the breastfeeding movement at this point, and three different sort of frameworks or ideologies that breastfeeding is attached to. It's attached to a back to nature sort of Christian worldview, it's attached to a feminist worldview, and it's attached to a leftist anti-corporate worldview. Mm-hmm. And now we're in the 1990s or so. And in the 1990s, along comes attachment parenting. And attachment parenting, starting in the 1990s, becomes the most popular parenting philosophy in especially in North America, and also Australia and New Zealand, less so in Europe. But attachment parenting is really it's what it sounds like. That it's attachment, it's parenting very closely. And there are three sort of main prongs or commitments that people have who are attachment parents. The first is baby wearing, which is literally wearing your baby in a sling rather than putting your
Right.
baby in a stroller.
I have seen this. I have seen this in person. I have seen people doing it in New York and Los Angeles many a time with a baby. They strap their babies to them in a
Yes.
Bjorn, I believe is what it's called.
Well, the Bjorn is not even. If you're a real attachment parent, you really like to use a sling. The Bjorn is a little too much of a contraption. But anyway, yeah, especially on the coasts, East and West Coast, people like attachment parenting.
Okay.
So there's the sling, there's co-sleeping, which means sleeping in bed with your baby. If you're an attachment parent, you do not use a crib for your baby. And the third sort of component of attachment parenting is breastfeeding. And it's not just breastfeeding, but it's baby-led weaning or child-led weaning. So it's breastfeeding for 2 or 3 years. It's a very serious commitment to breastfeeding. And it's with attachment parenting. I mean, you can get the impression, as I describe the tenets of attachment parenting, you might have realized that you can really only practice attachment parenting if you're fairly well off. It's really full-time parenting, and you can't do it if you have a job as the mother. It's
Right, the
really
time
a
commitment of all
commitment.
that.
Oh, absolutely. The time commitment is complete. It's a 24-hour-a-day job, 7 days a week, attachment parenting. And so breastfeeding, then I think it's in that period that breastfeeding really becomes a commitment that is primary among women in the middle and upper middle classes. And that's when you start to see a very sharp division in breastfeeding numbers between women who are wealthier and who can rely on a, single income household, and women who are poorer and have to work and might not have the time to be either attachment parenting or breastfeeding.
That's fascinating because it sounds like what happened was when formula initially came on the scene, that was the more sort of affluent modern choice, right? Because it cost money to do, and it's like, oh well, I'm not a beast of the field. I'll feed my I'll feed my baby pure science that I purchased with my currency. That's the sort of like more upper middle class choice. But then when the pendulum swung back, breastfeeding became the upper class choice because it required so much time. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. It's because it required time, attention, and also it's part of a back to nature movement. So it's like organic food and hormone-free milk and stuff like that. So it's part of feeding your baby only the best and only what's natural.
And so that sort of cultural shift is started with attachment parenting, and now it's what sort of taken hold in a broader way, like among the public at large.
Well, yeah. I mean, attachment parenting has taken hold in a broader way. There aren't that many people who are really fully able to practice attachment parenting, to do everything that's required. But as a general philosophy, I would say it's the dominant contemporary philosophy of parenting.
Like you might even do it even if you might even do part of it even if you don't know what attachment parenting is. You've sort of absorbed culturally some of the it's caused a sea
Absolutely.
change.
I would say most parents today in the United States, in Canada, even in Europe, most parents are sort of practicing a half-baked version of attachment parenting.
Got it. Well, I'm here talking to Professor Courtney Jung. We will be back in just a moment, so stick around.
Following the news is hard and it sucks.
How do you know which stories are important?
Which sources do you trust in this post-truth world of reactionary journalism?
I'm Brett Black.
And I'm Travis McElroy.
And we host a podcast called Trends Like These.
We cover trending news stories.
We debunk misleading clickbait headlines.
And we always try to throw in a little bit of good news.
In our quest for truth.
So join us every week on MaximumFun.org or wherever podcasts are found.
Welcome back to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I'm here talking to Professor Courtney Jung, the author of Lactivism. Well, so let's talk about a topic that I'm sure is on everybody's mind who's listening to this and wondering when we're going to get to it, because there are so many health advantages that are claimed for breastfeeding. And this is what I think, at least friends of mine who I've spoken to who are trying to, decide how to feed their children feel inundated by, that it helps with, this or that medical condition, or it's better for your baby in way XYZ. What are those claims, and is there any validity to them?
So the claims are actually really astonishing. When I was writing my book, I, went out and tried to find what are the things that people claim for are the benefits of breastfeeding. And it literally is almost everything, including, heart disease, Crohn's disease, obesity, intelligence, cancer, Hodgkin's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, infections.
Wow.
Everything, almost everything. You can find some article somewhere that claims that breastfeeding reduces the risk of X. So the claims are extreme.
But the difference seems to be that I think we all know how health studies work. There's probably a claim for every substance that it reduces every disease somewhere out there. Someone's done a study that claims something, but the thing in this case is that people fervently believe that it does.
Right. This is information that is routinely repeated and repeated in important places by people who ought to know better. So it is surprising. Most of the research on breastfeeding is either weak or inconclusive. And the reason is that people who do research on breastfeeding don't do double-blind tests. So they don't compare breastfeeding mothers with non-breastfeeding mothers in a way that's randomized. They don't do randomized controlled trials because they can't randomize some mothers to breastfeed and some mothers not to breastfeed. So the problem is that the mothers who breastfeed also have many other things in common. Mothers who breastfeed are also less likely to work. They're less likely to send their children to daycare. They're less likely to smoke, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of other things that those mothers also happen to have in common. And if you compare mothers who breastfeed with mothers who don't breastfeed, those other things could be the reason for the difference between the breastfeeding and the non-breastfeeding babies, the outcomes. So what you have to do if you have those kinds of studies is you have to control for the other variables that those mothers have in common. And the more variables you need to control for, the larger the numbers of the women in the studies need to be, et cetera, et cetera. And there are very, very few studies that actually have enough women to control for all of the other things that they would need to control for. So you have some studies that control for class. You have some studies that control for whether women are in the workplace. Other studies that control for smoking. So you're really comparing in many cases, you're comparing different categories of women. You're not comparing the same thing. So given the paucity and the weakness of our actual research on breastfeeding, what is it that we do know for sure? We know that breastfeeding reduces the risk of infection. So there are 3 different types of infections that babies are vulnerable to: ear infections, lung infections, and gastrointestinal infections. And not only is there research that shows that babies who breastfeed have fewer infections, but doctors and medical researchers have also figured out exactly what the logic is of the ways in which breast milk reduces the risk of infection. So they actually know how it works. So we're sure that breastfeeding reduces the risk of infection.
And so that's a real effect and a real benefit that we know about.
That's a real effect and a real benefit. However, it is a very, very modest benefit and effect. So, for example, to explain how modest it is, the figures that are given are that 6 women would have to breastfeed exclusively for 6 months in order to prevent 1 ear infection.
Okay.
So that is to say, it has an effect at the level of the population as a whole, right? If you're a breastfeeding advocate, if you're a public health advocate, and you've got 6 women breastfeeding exclusively for 6 months, you multiply that exponentially, you've got 6 million women breastfeeding exclusively for 6 months. That actually adds up to quite a few ear infections, right? But if you're one woman making a calculation about the impact of your breastfeeding on your baby, the chances are that your breastfeeding won't ever avert any ear infection in your own baby.
That's actually a very nice way to break down the issue, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about these sort of public health issues, there's a difference between what we want to encourage as a society and what we want to choose individually. And so it sounds like this is enough of a benefit where we would say, hey, we want to encourage people to breastfeed. Go out and do it. It'll result in a slightly healthier population overall, because we'll be preventing ear infections and therefore, I guess, not using antibiotics and stuff like that, not having to treat those ear infections.
Right.
But if you're an individual woman, you don't, saying, oh, geez, do I have to breastfeed because I've been told about this, about how it's, I'm going to be hurting my baby if I don't, XYZ. It doesn't sort of put an ethical obligation on you to, breastfeed your child if that's extremely difficult or impossible for you to do.
That's absolutely right. But you can see where the problem lies, is that people believe that breastfeeding improves your life, the life chances of your baby exponentially. People believe that it's absolutely crucial for child health and development. And if we as a society believe that it's absolutely crucial for child health and development, and if we also believe that all women can breastfeed, and those are basically the twin tenets of the breastfeeding movement, that all women can breastfeed and that breastfeeding is crucial for infant health and development, then of course we're going to believe that all women should breastfeed. Not that this should be something that should be left up to individual choice and, weighing the circumstances in your life and deciding whether it's a good choice for you.
Right. I mean, I read a blog post once, when I was sort of, researching this issue and trying to see what people were writing, in this space. I found a blog post by, a self-described mommy blogger. So I'm not saying that derogatorily. That was how she described her own site. But it was an article arguing, hey, people say it's not my business if I breastfeed my child or not, or it's not your business if I breastfeed my child or not. Here's why I think it is my business whether or not you breastfeed your child. Because if you don't breastfeed your child, it's not going to develop mentally well enough, and it's going to be of below average intelligence, and it's going to have all these other problems, and then I'm going to suffer the social effects of your when your baby grows up, and it's it has poor impulse control, and it has behavioral problems and mental problems. That's going to affect me. So yes, you do have to breastfeed. I was sort of shocked by that argument, because this was a person saying that it's an ethical obligation for every single person to breastfeed, and we're able to put that obligation on each other. And this was someone writing this very sincerely on a not very fringy, at least to me, it didn't look like a very fringy site. It looked like it was a site that's in this sort of like blogosphere of mothers writing about the issue. And so that's when it really struck me how strongly and how sort of ideological this has gotten.
That's absolutely right. And that is not a fringe opinion at all. That is the mainstream opinion.
So, and what are the negative effects of that, opinion or that way of thinking?
Well, the negative impact is on women who either choose not to breastfeed or who can't breastfeed, because they feel terrible. They feel like they're failures as mothers. They feel shamed. So we have a whole culture now in which women feel that if they don't breastfeed, they're really failing as parents. And one of the ways in which this is, well, it's problematic in a lot of different ways. You know, new mothers are very, very vulnerable. And so they feel terrible about this. They're worried, they're scared, and they don't know what they're doing. And so they take advice in ways where, or at times where they feel like they would otherwise be very sure. You know, women who are otherwise very sure of themselves become very vulnerable and insecure right after they've given birth.
I would too. I mean, that's completely understandable. I mean, everyone is always worried that they're not doing whatever they're supposed to be doing well enough. You know, that's sort of a general.
Right. Well, that's magnified.
Yes.
When you've had a baby,
I
especially
can't imagine.
your first baby. So, there are psychiatrists who are concerned with postpartum depression, or who focus on postpartum depression, who believe that the pressure to breastfeed is an exacerbating condition that leads to or contributes to postpartum depression. So that's a big worry now, is that it's increasing the incidence of postpartum depression. Mothers who have been unable to breastfeed or unable to produce enough milk to feed their babies adequately have told me that it exacerbates body dysmorphia. So women who already have body issues, or who are worried that their bodies are inadequate or don't look right or don't, respond well, this is something that gets much, much worse after pregnancy and postpartum if they also can't breastfeed. So it feeds into a whole nest of other issues that women are facing. So that's part of the reason that it's bad. But it's also bad because it feeds into class and race issues. So it really reinforces a lot of the stereotypes and hierarchies that already exist in our societies. So in the United States, for example, poor women breastfeed much less than wealthy women, and African American women breastfeed much less than white women. And all of those breastfeeding figures are always reported by race and by class in the United States. So every year when the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention publish their breastfeeding figures, how are we doing in the United States, they always publish those broken down by race and class. And those kinds of figures reinforce stereotypes about the pathology of the Black family and the pathologies of poor families, and basically reinforce the idea that white, wealthy, and upper middle class and middle class families are not only better parents but better citizens.
I also know that you have written about how the emphasis on breastfeeding that certain large health organizations like the WHO have promoted have caused problems. Can you tell us about that at all?
Oh, yeah. Starting in 1981, the CDC first reported the first cases of AIDS. So AIDS first came to the United States, or we first realized that AIDS existed in 1981.
I kind of have a hunch that the rest of this story isn't going to go well.
It's not going to go well. It gets worse.
If you started with in 1981, AIDS was first reported.
Right.
So please go on.
In 1982, doctors started to suspect that HIV could be transmitted through breast milk, because you get your first cases of children who have HIV and are developing AIDS-like symptoms, and they have not in any other way been exposed to HIV. So doctors start to suspect in 1982, and in 1985, the well-known medical journal, The Lancet, published the first research demonstrating that HIV was present in breast milk and that babies were developing HIV because of exposure to breast milk. So 1985, we know that HIV is transmitted through breast milk. So that's 1985. In 1985, the CDC and public health organizations in Canada, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand all immediately changed their recommendations to ensure that women who are HIV positive will not breastfeed. Right. So that information is disseminated in Europe, the United States, etc., in 1985, and those countries immediately changed their policies about HIV and breastfeeding. But the World Health Organization and UNICEF do not change their policies, and they continue to recommend that women breastfeed regardless of their HIV status. And in the 1980s and into the 1990s, you have countries in sub-Saharan Africa where 30% of pregnant women are HIV positive. In places like Uganda, Mozambique, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and other places in Central African Republic, etc. Very, very high rates of HIV infection in women who are pregnant and who are breastfeeding. And the World Health Organization and UNICEF not only continue to recommend that women who are HIV positive should still breastfeed, but they actually publish misinformation about the relationship between HIV and breastfeeding. So they say things like, in one publication, breastfeeding, the fact that HIV could be transmitted through breastfeeding is covered in a section of the publication called Spreading False Myths. And in other cases, they say it has been known to happen, but it's very rare. And this is at a point when all the medical journals are publishing information showing that HIV is transmitted through breastfeeding in 14 to 29% of cases. So not every baby whose mother is HIV positive will develop HIV. It depends on the viral load of the mother. It depends on a number of things, but importantly, the viral load of the mother.
I mean, for a disease like HIV/AIDS, that's 14% chance is plenty. Plenty to avoid.
Right. So it's between 14 and 29% is the number that they come up with in 1992. So between 1985 and 1992, they don't really know what percentage of babies are developing HIV through breastfeeding, but in 1992 they come up with this number 14 to 29%.
And so why would the WHO avoid spreading that information or not change their recommendations, or what possible reason? I mean, the WHO is it's an organization dedicated to public health. I don't really understand.
Right. So World Health Organization, right? That's what the WHO is. Health. Right. So the reason is that following the Nestle boycott and Nestle aggressively marketing in poor countries, organizations like UNICEF and the World Health Organization invested heavily in breastfeeding advocacy in poor countries as a way of combating the formula marketing that was also happening in poor countries.
And it makes total sense that they would do so.
Yes, absolutely. So you have breastfeeding. So they hired breastfeeding advocates in very high positions at the World Health Organization, and they put them in charge of infant feeding programs in poor countries. And those people were in charge of those programs when it was reported that HIV, so when 1981 and 1985 come along, the WHO and UNICEF are being controlled by breastfeeding advocates who firmly believe that breastfeeding is the solution to many of the infant malnutrition and mortality problems in poor countries. They believe that breastfeeding is basically the silver bullet. And they're concerned that HIV is going to derail their breastfeeding campaigns.
I mean, and I totally understand that if you're committed to that cause, especially with good reason, where you're like, hey, we had babies dying because of this problem with dirty water and formula. We need them to breastfeed, and you're devoting your life or your decade to that cause. I understand why the HIV/AIDS issue comes over the transom, and you're like, hey, this is just a speed bump. We don't want to. We don't want to derail our whole initiative here, so maybe let's downplay this at the very least. I totally understand. That's a very human response to that happening.
Right. Except that it happened for 13 years.
Okay.
So for 13 years, they continued to recommend that women who are HIV positive should breastfeed their babies. And for 13 years, you have, millions of babies dying.
Wow. Well, I mean, this goes to show the issue with these pendulum swings. That I love that that metaphor that you used at the beginning, because it shows how when we go too extreme in one direction or the other, or we get too set in our ways, it can the horrible effects in both directions. It's
absolutely
neither of these is to say that breastfeeding is dangerous or that formula feeding is dangerous. They had, when taken too far or when treated as the only solution to be promoted and spread across the world, they ended up having these bad side effects in certain areas. But the solution is to be inclusive of both approaches.
Right.
Well, so let me just ask, because we are running short on time, but I want to know how you summarize your research and your feeling on breastfeeding versus formula feeding overall. What is there a log line that if you're in an elevator with an expectant mother for 45 seconds, and she happens to ask your advice, what do you say?
I say, if you want to breastfeed, and if you find that breastfeeding is easy for you and it works for you and it works for your baby and your family, by all means do it. But if you find that it doesn't work for you, or if it makes you uncomfortable or you don't want to do it, switch to formula and don't feel guilty about it.
I'll be honest, I love any message that ends with "and don't feel guilty about it." I think at the very least, we could all do with less guilt about our choices,
especially around parenting.
Yes, 100%. Well, thank you so much, Courtney, for talking to us about this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you once again to Courtney for coming on the show. That is it for Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. We will be back in 2 weeks, so please tune in then. Our producer is Shara Morris, and if you like the show, please be sure to tell a friend about our podcast, subscribe to us on iTunes or your favorite podcast app, and don't forget to leave us a rating or comment wherever you subscribe. And once again, Adam Ruins Everything is back. We got all new episodes Tuesdays at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, most likely, right? And who knows, maybe it even airs in Mountain Time. You never even know. People, if you live in the mountains, please send me an email and let me know when the show airs where you are, and then I'll include it next time I do this promo. And no matter where you live, if you don't have a TV, you can find clips and full episodes of the show at truetv.com/AdamRuinsEverything and the Watch True TV app. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
MaximumFun.org.
Comedy and culture.
Artist owned.
Listener supported.